Hi, I'm Ellen from the Chili Dog, and today we're going to talk a little bit about how to correct mistakes in your knitting by laddering down adjacent columns of stitches. So this is a technique that can be used if you have maybe made a mistake in a kind of large section of your knitting, or if a mistake is made across multiple stitches that are a few rows down from where you're knitting. And you can use this so you can avoid ripping out rows and rows and rows of stitches. So instead, you just rip out and work down a smaller section of your knitting instead of the whole piece. Some tools that are really helpful when you're correcting mistakes is double pointed needles that are the same size as the needles that you're working on. And it can also be helpful to use either a crochet hook or a knitting needle that is a couple sizes smaller than what you're working on. So in this case, I have an Addi Duett hook here, and it actually has a crochet hook on one end and a knitting needle on the other. And another item that can be handy is a locking stitch marker or two. For demonstration purposes, we're going to imagine that I maybe forgot to work a section here at the center of my swatch, maybe in a stitch like moss stitch. And I'm doing it this way instead of actually fixing mistakes because I think it's a little bit easier to see and understand the process of laddering down and reworking your stitches. Before we begin, one thing to remember: when you are correcting errors by laddering down multiple columns, often it's easier to work on a flat surface like a table like I am, instead of trying to manage your work on your lap. Let's get started. Before we can fix our mistake, we need to ladder down our stitches. So we're going to imagine that my mistake happened here in this center column of stitches, and perhaps I want to ladder down, we'll say 12 rows. I can't drop these stitches off my needle here while they're at the center of my work. So I need to rearrange things so that these stitches that I want to drop are at the tips of my needle. You can do this two ways. You can either work across in your pattern to where you want to start dropping your stitches, or you can just slip those stitches out of the way. And today I'm choosing to slip the stitches out of the way, and I'm just slipping purlwise. And the reason I'm slipping instead of working them for this demonstration is just so that I can keep my working yarn out of the way. And it just is going to make it a little bit easier for you to see what's happening. So now that I've slipped to where that center panel begins, I can simply slip my left needle out of all of these stitches. And this is a little bit scary the first time you do it. So I'm going to just slip out of these center stitches. Then I'm going to make sure that, my needle tips are pushed in a little bit so that the remaining stitches don't just fall off my needles. And you can see here, nothing is happening to their stitches. They're just staying right where they are because my work is set on a table. And now I want to ladder down 12 rows. So I need to unravel just this series of stitches. And I'm going to use my double pointed needle. And we're just going to gently pull on the yarn and ladder down. Once it gets started, you can even use your fingers. So now I have one ladder rung here and one row has been unknit. So we're going to keep on going down the ladder. So now I've laddered down my 12 rows, and things may look a little bit scary here, but it's really not nearly as bad as it looks. And the first thing we want to do is get these loose stitches here transferred back onto our needle so that they can't unravel anymore. And it looks like maybe I forgot here on the side to get a couple. So it's very helpful to use a knitting needle that's smaller than the one that you're working on to transfer the stitches back. And as I'm transferring them back, I'm not going to worry about how they're mounted. All I'm going to worry about is getting my knitting needle through the center of the stitch in whatever way is easiest. And if they happen to be mounted wrong, I'll fix that in just a minute. So I'm just going to go through my stitches and just make sure that I'm going through every one, however it's easy to get through the stitch. Now that the stitches are back on my needle, I don't have to worry about anything unraveling any further. Before I can start re-knitting what I have undone, we need to make sure that the stitches are mounted properly, and we need to get these sized correctly also, because this is a smaller needle, so the stitches may be snugger than they need to be. So this is where I'm going to use a DPN that's the same size as what I'm working with, and make sure that my stitches are transferred from the smaller needle to my bigger needle, and I need to make sure they're mounted properly. And what I mean is every stitch has 2 legs, and conventionally you have the right hand leg, or what I like to call the leading leg of the stitch, is at the front of the needle. So I just need to make sure that the right leg or leading leg of my stitches are at the front of my knitting needle as I transfer them back. And I'm working from left to right here as I transfer. And it looks like these first couple stitches are mounted properly, but this one is backwards. Here, the left leg or the trailing leg is at the front of the needle, so I just need to switch that around so that the leading leg is at the front. So I can just gently twist it. And here's another one that's not conventional. So we'll twist it back so that the right hand leg is at the front of the needle and the left or trailing leg is at the back. And transferring back to this needle again, it helps make sure that they're sized properly, because this is the same size as what I'm working on. So I just want to make sure that the yarn is distributed evenly and that my stitches are sized properly. Now we need to start knitting up the ladder one rung at a time. So you can kind of spread out the stitches here, and you can see we want to start here with this lowest rung of the ladder, and then gradually, one by one, reknit all the stitches across up the ladder. One thing that can happen is all of these extra yarns can kind of get in your way a little bit, and you don't want to accidentally start working with them. You want to work with whatever the lowest rung of the ladder is. So you can use a locking stitch marker to separate out. You separate out the lowest rung that you're going to work with, and then all of these other rungs of the ladder can go into your locking stitch marker so that you don't accidentally grab one and work with it, and then these can be out of the way so that you can see what you're doing as you start reknitting your stitches. Now I'm ready to start reknitting the stitches in this center panel. My stitches are held right now on my larger needle that's the same size as my working needles, and I'm going to use a smaller knitting needle to rework the stitches across here using this lowest rung of the ladder as the yarn that I'm working with. I'm using a smaller needle to reknit these stitches because as you work across this little row, manipulating the rung to form the stitches can be a little bit tricky. Using a smaller needle to form the stitches gives you a little bit of extra wiggle room as you work. So we're going to imagine that perhaps I forgot to do moss stitch up this center panel. So I'm just going to knit one, purl one across this row using this lowest rung of my ladder. So I'm going to slide my stitches down to the needle tip, and let me zoom in a little bit here. And then we're going to use this lowest rung to reknit our stitches. My first stitch is a knit stitch, so I want the working yarn at the back. I'm going to insert my smaller needle through, wrap the yarn around counterclockwise, and pull it through to make my first stitch, and then drop it off my left needle. My next stitch I want to be a purl, so I'm going to bring my working yarn forward between the two needles, insert my knitting needle purlwise, and again wrap this yarn counterclockwise around the needle and pull it through the stitch and drop it off the tip. My next stitch is a knit, so bring the working yarn back between the needles, insert my needle tip knitwise from front to back, wrap counterclockwise, and whoop, I dropped it. Let's try again. Wrap counterclockwise and pull it through. My next stitch is a purl, so I need to bring my working yarn forward between the needles, insert my needle tip from back to front, wrap around counterclockwise, and pull it through. And now I'm just going to keep working across my row of stitches. And as you can see, when you get to this last stitch here, it can be tricky to grab that rung. And it's right here. And pull it through. So I've reworked the stitches across one row, and now we're going to transfer them back because the ones over here are a little bit tighter and the ones over here are a little bit looser. So we're going to transfer them back to our normal sized knitting needles that we're working with so that we can get the size of these back to what they should be. And this time they should, since I worked them properly, they should all be mounted correctly. So I should just be able to slip them from the right needle to the left needle without having to twist them or worry about the mounting. The leading leg should be at the front for all of them. Now that they're all back onto my regular size needle, I'm just going to make sure that the yarn is distributed evenly here so that I don't have any loose stitches or tight stitches and that they're all about the same size. And again, you can use your smaller needle tip to do that. So now they're all about the right size and I don't have anything that's super loose or large there. So now I'm going to repeat the same process with the next rung. So I'm going to zoom out again. So you can see here's the next rung that I need to knit with. So I need to release that from my group of stitches up here. So here's the next rung. We're going to get it free. I may mean taking them all out. So there's the next rung that I need to use. And I'm going to clip up the rest of the stitches out of the way so I can keep working. And then I'll repeat the same process by reworking the stitches with this thread across the stitches and keep working up the ladder. Generally, when I have laddered down a series of stitches like this, I prefer to use a crochet hook instead of a double pointed needle to work across the row of stitches, because it makes it just a little bit easier to manipulate the stitches and work this lowest rung of the ladder. And let me show you how to do it with a crochet hook. I've got my stitches right now are held again on my regular sized DPN that's the same size as my working needle, and I'm using the lowest rung to work the next row of stitches. And let's zoom in. So just like before, I'm going to work from right to left, and I'm going to start by sliding my stitches down to the needle tip, and I'm doing knit, purl across just like before. So I'm going to insert my hook knitwise, and you're just pretending it's just like your knitting needle. You insert knitwise, your yarn gets wrapped around counterclockwise just like always, and it's a little bit easier. You don't have to wrap quite as far because you can use the hook to grab the stitch and pull it through. So you don't have to do quite as much manipulation with your fingers, and then you can drop it off. My next stitch is a purl, so I'm bringing my working yarn forward between the needles, hopefully. I'm inserting my hook purlwise through the stitch, wrapping counterclockwise, and again, this hook makes it a little bit easier to manipulate, so you don't have to do quite so much with your fingertips, and then pull it through. The next stitch is a knit, so my yarn is going to go to the back. Insert my hook knitwise, wrap counterclockwise, and pull it through. The yarn comes forward, and to me this just seems a little bit easier to manipulate. Insert purlwise, wrap counterclockwise, and pull it through. I'll keep working across the row. And you may notice here as I'm getting close to the end of this row of stitches, I have a little bit of extra yarn in that rung to manipulate things just because of the way my stitches are formed. I can pull them a little tighter over here, so I have a little bit of extra yarn, and it makes it just a little bit easier to manipulate. And my needle fell out, but that's okay. I'm going to grab that yarn and get it around my hook counterclockwise and then pull it through that stitch. And just like before, some of these stitches, they're not really evenly sized, so let's zoom out and we'll just transfer them back onto our needle. And I think it's a little bit easier with the crochet hook too to get this lowest rung that we just knit resized and to get this yarn through and resized properly. So let me show you. So you slip the first stitch over and you can kind of tug it just a little bit. But we can get that yarn distributed evenly just a little bit easier, I think. And then take the hook out. And then just check again and make sure that everything really is, the yarn did get distributed evenly, and it looks like maybe that first stitch there is a little bit wonky. And then once your yarn is distributed evenly, you're ready to work the next rung of the ladder. I have corrected my stitches all the way up to this last top rung of my ladder. So now I'm going to correct this very last row, and again I'm just going to continue using my crochet hook because I think it's a little easier. So I'll work across this top rung. And now that that top rung is back onto my needle and I've corrected the stitches, instead of transferring them onto my double pointed needle that I've been using as I worked up this panel, I can actually now transfer the stitches from my hook onto the regular needles that I was using for my knitting. And again, we just want to make sure that that yarn is distributed evenly across these last few stitches. So we'll just transfer things over to our left needle. And just spread things out just to make sure that it's distributed evenly. And it looks like things are a little bit tighter on this side than this side. So we'll just distribute that yarn across. And now if I had knit to this point at the very beginning, I could just continue knitting my work. Since I slipped it, my working yarn is over here at the end, I'm going to slip my stitches back from the right needle to the left needle. And now my mistake, or imaginary mistake in this case, has been fixed, and I reknit this entire center column without having to rip out rows and rows of stitches. For a swatch this size, it may seem kind of silly. It would have been just as easy to rip out. But if you were working something larger like a sweater or a blanket maybe, just ripping out this small section, fixing it is a lot faster than ripping out rows and rows of your piece. I hope you enjoyed learning how to correct mistakes by laddering down adjacent columns of stitches. And if you did, make sure to subscribe to my channel, The Chili Dog, on YouTube. Give this video a thumbs up and share it with your friends. Until we stitch again, happy knitting!